one of the aspects that I learned yesterday, and that was one of the takeaways, that we must collaborate closely with each other, with academics as well as our communities, to share all our initiative, projects, and programs with each other. There are innovative developments going on in our backyards, and I sincerely believe that we as Carbika could play a vital role in this in the near future. Today, the focus will be on community archives, specifically on archivists and community. That's the first session. And the second session will be on community archiving initiative. In this session, we consider the ways in which archivists and archival institutions can engage their communities in promoting and preserving community memory and archival materials. Professor Jeannette Bastian will share her new book, Archiving Culture, Heritage, Community, and the Making of Records and Memory, that was published this year. And our colleagues from St. Lucia, Barbados, Suriname, and Jamaica will share different initiatives, opportunities, and strategies they have used to engage their community about archives and memory. We have 5 speakers for the first roundtable discussion. Each speaker will speak for 5 to 7 minutes. And after the 5 presentation, we have time for a roundtable discussion. We will also take questions from the participants. Our first speaker for today is Professor Jeannette A. Bastian. Her name and publication have been mentioned several times by Lorraine today. Who is Professor Jeannette A. Bastian? She is Professor Emerita at the School of Library and Information Science, Simmons University, Boston, Massachusetts, where she retired their archives management concentration from 1999 until 2019. A former Territorial Librarian of the United States Virgin Islands, Jeannette holds an M.Phil from the University of the West Indies and a Ph.D. from the University of Pittsburgh. She is currently an Honorary Fellow in the Department of Information at the University of the West Indies, where she supervises the first cohort of M.Phil and PhD candidates. Professor Bastian has published over 7 books, including her very latest release, Archiving Culture, Heritage, Community, and the Making of Records and Memory. So thank you, Professor Jeannette Bastian. The second presenter is Mrs. Margot Thomas. Margot Thomas was appointed National Archivist of St. Lucia in 1992, having graduated from University College London with a Master of Arts in Archive Administration and Records Management. Mrs. Thomas was a Commonwealth Fellow in 1996, President of Carbika from 1997 until 2001, Executive Member of the International Council on Archives from 1999 till 2001, and President of the Memory of the World for Latin American and the Caribbean region from 2009 until 2012. In June 2008, Mrs. Thomas was inducted in the National Heroes Gallery for students and presented with the Eagle Award for Excellence in Record Management and Archiving. And in February 2014, she was awarded the St. Lucia Medal of Merit, Gold, for her contribution to archiving. She's the author of 4 books, including From Slavery to Freedom, Aspects of Slavery in St. Lucia, and numerous articles on St. Lucian archives, memory, and record keeping. Above all, Mrs. Thomas leads a dynamic archival institution meeting the memory keeping needs of her country and region with innovative programs and services. The next presenter is Antonia Charlemagne Marshall. Antonia Charlemagne Marshall is the Deputy Digitization Director of the Digitization Center with the Minister of Industry, Innovation, Science, and Technology in Barbados. She's a certified archivist and has worked in the record management archives profession for several years. She was part of the first cohort to complete the Archives and Record Management program at the University of the West Indies, Mona. During the program, she was the 2019 recipient of the Harold T. Pinkett Minority Student Award from the Society of the American Archivists and internships at regional and international archives at the National Archives Authority of St. Lucia, Smithsonian Institution Archives of American Art, and UNICEF. She's also one of the book chapter's authors and Professor Jeannette Bastian's book, Archiving Caribbean Identity, Records, Community, and Memory. The next one is Ms. Audrey Hofbeck-Skunders, and it's an honor to introduce my deputy head today. Who is Audrey Hofbeck-Skunders? She's an archivist working at the Surinamese National Archives for 20 years. She's currently the deputy director for the director of National Archives Suriname. For a master research paper at the University of the West Indies, Audrey initiated a crowdsourcing project in Suriname using the Groninger model. In addition to her position at the National Archives, Audrey is part-time lecturer at college and university levels. Last but not least, our speaker for today is Kimray Richard, was born in the rural parish of Westmoreland, Jamaica, and Kimray holds a BA in History, Honorary in History, and an MA in Archives and Record Management from the University of the West Indies, Mona, and an LLB Honors from the University London. He's now the Records and Information Administrator at the Ministry of Economic Growth in Jamaica. He's coordinating the implementation of the functional classification system as well as general oversight of the record management program within the ministry. He's a hiking enthusiast and avid reader of historical novels and science fiction. So these are 5 presenters we have for today. We will start with Professor Bastian. Let me see. She's already online. Yeah, thank you, Professor Bastian.
Okay, let me start though. And thank you very much for that introduction, Rita. And also on behalf of Stanley and John and myself, Lorraine, I'd really like to thank you for those very kind words. And I hope that this presentation will address some of your concerns. Those of you familiar with my writings over the past 2 decades know that I've continually explored and advocated expanding what it means to record and to archive beyond the textual, beyond the written, to include the many ways that people, communities, and nations express themselves, their heritage, their history, and their identity, be it through oral traditions, performative events, materiality, the landscape itself. And I'm not the only one, as you just heard from Lorraine's excellent talk. Archivists, social historians, knowledge workers have been similarly concerned, particularly in those non-Western areas of the world. So a lot of theorizing has been going on, but it's been difficult to figure out how that translates into archival practice. And over the past 3 years, I've been thinking about that practical challenge, and this book is the result. So in the 5 to 7 minutes that Stanley has given me, and I've already used 1 minute, I'd like to take you through some of my thoughts on this critical issue for our archival future. So let me just share my screen. Let's see. And hold on. I'm trying to. Okay, so here's in the cultural archives. Oh, sorry about this. Okay. So communities and societies throughout the world express and document their heritage and culture through a broad variety of tangible and intangible forms and formats, in addition to text, that include but not limited to oral traditions, performative arts, festivals, commemorations, materiality, monuments. Often not recognized as records in the traditional Western sense, these dynamic, often fluid expressions, in fact, form part of the legitimate archives of a community and are critical components of documenting societies. So why this book? Western archival models codified in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and focusing on the administrative needs of governments and institutions have proven inadequate to fully accommodate the wide variety of records, the memories of records of a global society. Archivists need to think out of the Jenkinsonian Schellenberg box, and new models are needed to meet the records needs of an international post-colonial and decolonial environment. And I hypothesize such a model as a cultural archives. At the heart of this hypothesis is an understanding of archives that considers intangible cultural expressions and tangible documentation equally as records, and asks how they can be legitimately and seamlessly accommodated and subsumed within archival practice. So I'm not suggesting discarding traditional archival theory or archival models, but expanding and rethinking those models and that theory to embrace what we might call, but I wouldn't actually call, non-traditional records, the oral heritage and cultural expressions that define the ways that many communities and nations record and preserve their heritage and identity. So the theory, what kind of archival framework can accommodate these cultural expressions, which are often in formats not recognized as archival? And one of the areas I explore is kind of equating and putting together archival heritage and cultural heritage. An important aspect of archival theory that's both cultural heritage and archival heritage, of course, is provenance. Expanding ideas of what provenance means. And over the past decade, which I don't have time to go into, there's been a lot of exploring of societal provenance, ethnic provenance, looking at provenance in a much wider way. And I am suggesting here a cultural provenance. And of course, redefining and expanding the record itself. As you probably know, Terry Cook said, behind the record lies the need to record, to bear evidence, to hold and be held accountable, to create and maintain memory. And this is a concept. It's not a text. It's not a manuscript. The need to record can be on a cave painting. It can be a quilt. The need to record can be an oral expression. It can be an origin story. It can be a folktale. It has wide implications. And so we have to look at the record not as I said, a manuscript or a government report, but the record as a process, as a persistent entity that is both fixed and dynamic. Let's see if I can. And so what about practice? What exactly am I talking about? I'm talking about oral heritage, oral traditions, music, folkways, medical law, legal property discussions. And for example, oral heritage is vast. It covers all aspects of human life. I'm talking about performative expressions, carnivals, dance, commemorations. I'm talking about materiality, monuments, memorials, the landscape, the landscape and is also a multi-generational record. And of course, I always talk about collective and community memory and how that collective and community memory becomes, in a sense, a record for the community, an intangible record, and yet still a record. So how do we do it? We're very fortunate to live in an age of digital technology. This is what everyone's been talking about for the past day and a half. And these offer possibilities of creating cultural archives that can put together the textual, the oral, the tangible, the intangible, that can express records in a fluid and a dynamic way. And so in some ways, in the digital world, we can do whatever we want. The limits are only our own imagination. A few things you can find that help that imagination is the idea of living archives. And I would like to be able to show examples, but don't have the time. But you can find them on the web. You Google living archives, and these are archives in which change, in which are dynamic, where it's oral and music, but it's also people themselves adding, people having conversations. The archives constantly change and responds to the community that created and is concerned with it. Of course, various digital gatherings, community websites, multimedia digital interventions, and of course, community archives, the topic of this panel. Community archives have really been in the vanguard of bringing together diverse types forms and formats and looking beyond the textual records. But more important than anything else is having an archival mindset, is thinking archivally, not just thinking archivally about archives, but thinking archivally about dance, thinking archivally about oral traditions, thinking archivally about commemorations, memorials, where you live, your landscape, thinking about them in archival terms. So provenance, order, custody and ownership, values such as evidence, memory, and identity. These are broadly applicable to all kinds of disciplines if you can imagine them expansively and globally. So I'd like to conclude, I think my 7 minutes is up, by saying that in the 1970s, Gerald Ham, who was then president of the Society of American Archivists, declared that the mission of the archives was to hold up a mirror to mankind. Today, that mission is still unfulfilled, awaiting the day when all peoples and cultures have voices in the archives. And thank you very much.